Today, March 24th, 2022, liberal globalism officially collapsed. You can mark your calendar on that one. The whole geopolitical project beginning in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union and Francis Fukuyama's neocon fantasy of the end of history, where he envisioned that the entire world would now turn to a global neoliberal order that has since culminated in an epidemic of wokeness. That vision died last night, and Russian President Vladimir Putin killed it. Now, if you want to get a sense of what liberal globalism has become, particularly under the auspices of NATO, take a look at this.
At NATO,
diversity
is our strength.
Nous parlons une multitude de langues.
Nous possédons des talents différents.
Our own unique personalities.
We come from all over the world.
From every walk of life.
No two of us
are the same.
We work together.
Respect our needs.
Embrace our differences.
Because we all have one thing in common.
We are NATO.
Now, keep in mind, you can be absolutely sure Vladimir Putin has seen that video. He knows what NATO and much of the Western world has become. And what do you think he's making of all of that? Well, you don't have to speculate. All you have to do is see what he's doing right now in Ukraine, and you'll get your answer. So let's start with Putin's announcement last night. Quote, "Circumstances require us to take decisive and immediate action. The People's Republics of Donbass turned to Russia with a request for help. In this regard, in accordance with Article 51, Part 7 of the UN Charter, and the sanction of the Federation Council, and in pursuance of the friendship treaties ratified by the Federal Assembly and mutual assistance with the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, I have decided to conduct a special military operation." That's what it's being called. It's a special military operation in the Donbass region and wider Ukraine, with, as I understand it, the goal of cutting off Western Ukraine from Eastern Ukraine, militarily, politically, communicationally, all that. So obviously the very first question we have to answer is what is the, quote, circumstances Putin is referring to? Circumstances require us to take decisive and immediate action. What are these circumstances? First and foremost, as far as Russia is concerned, and I would agree with this assessment, the Minsk agreements were effectively killed by Ukraine's ongoing aggression towards the Donbass breakaway republics. Ukraine has been wholly uninterested in fulfilling their part of the Minsk protocol. Instead, they've been punishing the two breakaway territories with some pretty harsh blockades. They've been shelling the region nonstop. There are, according to Russia, 60,000 Ukrainian troops that remain in the Donbass region. And as a result, the Russian Federation having to come to terms with the notion that the Minsk agreements that they brokered, keep in mind, Russia has for the last 7 years been trying to get a ceasefire effected in this region. 7 years. Russia's come to the conclusion that the Minsk Accords are not going to ever be fulfilled. And so the Russian Federation officially recognized the two breakaway republics, Lugansk and Donetsk, as sovereign autonomous nations, which thus accounted for Russia's military buildup around the Ukrainian border. Once recognized, those autonomous regions would most likely require military intervention to expel Ukrainian forces from the region, hence the buildup. Once Putin recognized the autonomy of the regions, Russia gave an order to Ukraine that as part of this recognition, there was to be an immediate ceasefire of all hostilities, all shellings, and the withdrawing of Ukrainian troops from the Donbass region. That has not happened. I understand there was a brief reprieve after Putin's announcement, and then just something seemed to snap. Reports were that shelling from Ukrainian troops escalated, intensified significantly overnight, and around 4:30 a.m. this morning, the two republics of the Donbass formally requested Russia's intervention, and here we are. Now, I should say on the outset that I remain convinced that this is not what Russia wanted. They could have done this any time over the past 7 years, when Ukraine was far more unstable, when there was no functioning government. Crimea doesn't quite count because Russia didn't technically invade Crimea. Russia was already in Crimea. Crimea is a major military base for Russia. And the citizens there are overwhelmingly Russian. Again, this is the hangover of the old Soviet order. But regardless, Russia could have launched this kind of attack at any time over the last 7 years. But instead, they pursued every diplomatic path possible, culminating in the Minsk Accords. And NATO and the West appeared completely uninterested in getting Ukraine to fulfill their end of the bargain in those accords, which was to recognize at least some semblance of sovereignty for the Donbass region and to stop all hostilities toward the region. And now Russia, as of today, has decided to decisively end this conflict once and for all. Now, what's actually happening is very hard to determine. We're clouded by the fog of war at the moment. We're getting conflicting reports on Kiev and Odessa. There are clearly explosions in those areas, which would be consistent with taking out military targets, but there are conflicting reports on the presence of actual Russian ground troops in those regions. There are also conflicting reports as to whether Russian ground forces have entered into Ukraine from Belarus. I mean, we're in the midst of the fog of war at this point, and so it's going to take several days for it to clear. But already, leaders are pouncing on bumbling Biden for having lost yet another region of the world. First Afghanistan, now Ukraine, or at least the Donbass region. Tulsi Gabbard tweeted out, "This war and suffering could have easily been avoided if Biden admitted NATO had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine's becoming a member of NATO, which would mean U.S. NATO forces right on Russia's border." And what Tulsi's getting at there is this notion that in the end, Western leaders thought that the possibility of Ukrainian membership into NATO could be used as leverage against Russia. But we're finding out today that it was nothing less than a prodding tool that goaded the bear, and now that bear provoked has gotten really mad. For months now, the West has been telling Russia, you need to engage in diplomacy. And whenever Russia did so, the West would arrogate itself to telling Russia what it needs to do, which ultimately is to accept the unstoppable advance of liberal globalism through the sphere of NATO expansion. From Obama to Biden, the official position of the United States government and NATO is that Russia's going to have to bend the knee to liberal globalism one way or the other. They're going to have to get rid of Putin, and they're going to have to put in administrators who will allow Russians to go fully woke. And Putin, in effect, said, "Niet." That's not going to happen. Victor Davis Hanson has a great piece titled, "Why Putin Has Not Been Deterred." And it's an excellent assessment of the unraveling of the liberal globalist world order. If you want proof that the age of liberal globalism is dead, like we've been arguing for on this channel for the last 5 years, if you want proof that the old liberal woke globalist order is dead, all you have to do is look at how Putin is behaving right now. If the liberal globalist order were as strong as its leaders claim it is, Putin would never be doing what he's doing. But the fact is that his boldness is absolute evidence that liberal globalism is dead. And that's what Hanson is getting at. For example, NATO in many respects is completely fractured. Turkey's citizens, as well as their government, are far more aligned with Russia than they are with the United States. President Erdogan doesn't have a woke bone in his body. And the last I looked, the people of Turkey weren't all into the wokeness either, to say the least. Traditionalist societies like Turkey and Russia tend to align with one another, and that's precisely what we see happening. So Turkey is far more inclined towards Russia than they are the States or Western Europe. As for Germany, which is Europe's richest nation, the most recent Pew study found that 70% of Germans wanted closer relations with Russia. And astonishingly, 60% of Germans opposed going to war for another NATO nation that invoked Article 5. which requires all member nations to treat an attack on one of their members as an attack on all. Without Article 5, there is no NATO. So we're finding that Turkey, Germany, they're not on board anymore. Turning to the U.S., Putin sees an incredibly weak and woke president, so we talked about in our other videos. And it's not just the president. He looks at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, who appears more concerned about white privilege than he is about the Afghanistan troop withdrawal. Speaking of, by the way, we talked about this on our channel last August, but that botched troop withdrawal didn't just make America weaker on the world stage, which it certainly did for sure, but it also had the inadvertent effect of putting Russia, and most particularly Vladimir Putin, at the center of the world stage. We did a video on that. Britain in particular turned to Russia for what they called Russia's, quote, moderating influence over the Taliban. Macron did the same thing. Germany as well. Much of the world moved towards Moscow after the fall of Kabul, which we're going to get, by the way, we're going to get into more in the next video today. I'm getting ahead of myself. But more than that, and this is absolutely essential to get, bumbling Biden in the name of this ridiculous left-wing environmentalist project of green energy. Bumbling Biden reversed course on Trump's energy policy, which wasn't just about making America energy independent. It certainly did that. But Trump's policy of a mass increase in pumping oil and gas domestically had the effect of crashing Russian oil prices. And without the leverage of energy supply, Russia had little political leverage to do whatever they wanted geopolitically. And when you add to that Trump's taking on China and North Korea, his killing of the Iranian General Soleimani, his crushing of ISIS, there was no way that Putin was going to do anything like what we're seeing today. But now, with our energy independence squandered in the name of left-wing environmentalism, Russia can go back to dictating oil prices, which we're going to see happen in our own backyards in the coming days. Germany canceled the Nord Stream 2. They're going to see their energy costs skyrocket. Again, all in the name of woke environmentalism. All this feeds into Putin's sense that he has the West right where he wants them. And that is what has ultimately emboldened him to move on Ukraine. Don't forget, a number of Ukrainian expatriates and current government members worked with the American left to ensure the first impeachment of Trump, which was over his phone conversation with President Zelensky. So Ukraine doesn't necessarily have a lot of friends in Trump circles at this point either. They threw their lot in with Biden, hoping that making him rich would ensure massive American foreign aid, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. Now, we'll obviously be keeping our eyes on this ongoing and developing situation. I'll have more videos on it today, but make no mistake, as of today, all those pipe dreams of an unfettered liberal globalism expanding into Afghanistan and Ukraine and eventually Russia, they're dead. The liberal globalist order has officially come to an end, crushed decisively by Vladimir Putin.